Good morning. This is the Mack Road Church of Christ Sunday Samuel to Chronicles study. Good morning. Let's try this again. Sorry about that. I didn't check my settings, but now they're checked. Good morning. This is the Mack Road Church of Christ Sunday Samuel to Chronicles study. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 1, actually. Let me fix that for you here. We're actually in 2 Samuel chapter 1. And we're going to be looking at Chronicles just a little bit today. But this is where we're at. If you remember last week when we left off, we finished up the book of 1 Samuel. And 1 Samuel ended, if you remember, in chapter 31 with the death of Saul and his sons, and the fact that they'd had that battle with the Philistines. And that's where we left them off with David. And now we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel. And 2 Samuel is basically just a continuation of 1 Samuel. Matter of fact, at one time in the Hebrew Bible, it was actually just one book. They just divided it into two parts. And I think they did that because of the length and the idea of the scrolls, because the scrolls would become very lengthy. And so they would divide the books up to make the scrolls a little bit more convenient to be able to put, carry with them or to use. That kind of reminds me of when Jesus was in Nazareth and they asked him to read, and it says that he was looking for the prophet Isaiah. And what that means is that he's rolling up the scroll looking for the passage he wants to read. And so it takes some time. And so that's probably why they divided up the book. But it's 1 and 2 Samuel, but it's actually just one book. So the introduction for 1 Samuel is also the introduction for 2 Samuel. And so I'm not going to redo that. You might want to go through and take a look at 1 Samuel introductory material. But what I do want to show you is just the overview, like I do with all of the books. And remember, this comes from Jensen's chart. Like I've said, I've had these way back since 1981. And so it tells you how old these charts are, but they're still beneficial. And so here's the chapter settings up here. And this is 2 Samuel. And it's the second king of Israel, and it's about David. So it's about David's rule and reign. Remember that on this side over here, we're going to have the story that Saul just died. And so we notice that David then starts to begin to rule. He doesn't rule the whole country all at once. It takes a little bit of time for the whole country to get behind him. And that's what we have here as David his triumphs or his victories and his successes are being increased. And then until he sins with, of course, Bathsheba, and then we notice David's trouble starts after that. And so what we have here is we have the reign of David over Judah in this section here. That's in covers this section, and then we have David in Hebron, and so that's what we have here. And then you have 7.5 years, and so that makes 33 years in all for David to be ruling and reigning. So remember that he reigns over Judah first. Then he reigns over all of Israel. We're going to then read about the sin of David, which, as you notice, kind of takes center stage in this. Then we're going to notice the punishment of David as a result of the consequences of his sin. And then we're going to notice the restoration and some last words and acts of David and appendices, as you notice there. Also going along with that, remember that 2 Samuel is also covered in 1 Chronicles. And here's the chart for 1 Chronicles. If you notice down here, it says much of 1 Chronicles is reported in 2 Samuel. So a lot of the material we have in 2 Samuel is going to be over here in 1 Chronicles. Now, I gave you a small introduction to Chronicles last week, if not last week, the week before, just to point out that the first 9 chapters basically deal with genealogies. They deal with the genealogies of the tribe of David and them returning back from captivity. So you notice that this book was written sometime after their captivity in Babylon, or else that couldn't be put in there unless somebody added it later. But basically what you had is you had the genealogies of the patriarchs, and then you had the national period where it speaks about the genealogies of the kings and everybody else that's involved. And David's reign and the beginning of David. And then here, you basically starting in chapter 10, after it speaks about the death of Saul, which we already covered, it basically has highlights of the rule of David. And much of these, as we pointed out, are in First Chronicles, but we won't be getting into Second Samuel. The stuff in this section is covered in Second Samuel. Sometimes I get these little confused when I speak, but basically this goes from the time David becomes king and Saul dies until David himself dies, and his rule, his particular reign ends, and his son takes it over. But that's what First Chronicles is about. So as we go through the book of Samuel, we'll be pointing out those places where in the book of Chronicles it lists the same story, and we'll be looking at any differences, but we'll mainly be using Second Samuel as our text as we go through here, and not First Chronicles. But I just wanted to point that out to you as we get started here and we go through here. Now, as we take a look at this section, and notice that we are in First Chronicles. I'm sorry, let me get rid of all this. We're in Second Samuel, and we're in chapter 1 and verse 1. Remember that in First Samuel, the last chapter, Saul had just died at the hands of the Philistines, and the men from Jabesh Gilead, I believe, had come and taken down his body because they had beheaded him. The Philistines had beheaded him. They found him and his sons in the battlefield, and when they found them, they beheaded them and sent their heads as a parade, you might say, through all the cities of the Philistines as a display of victory over their enemies. And they took the bodies and they hung them on a wall. And the men of Jabesh Gilead came, and basically the brave men took the bodies and took them back and burned them, and then buried the bones. And so you have Saul dying. And so that's what we have here. We have the continuation of that as David hears about the death of Saul. And so let's just read this and we'll go through it. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1 says, "Now it came about after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David remained 2 days in Ziklag. On the third day, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes torn and dust on his head. And it came about when he came to David that he fell to the ground and prostrated himself. Then David said to him, From where are you? Where do you come? And he said to him, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. And David said to him, How did things go? Please tell me. And he said, The people have fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead also. So David said to the young man who told him, How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? And the young man who told him said, By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen pursued him closely. When he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I said, Here I am. He said to me, Who are you? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. Then he said to me, Please stand beside me and kill me, for agony has seized me, because my life still lingers in me. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown which was on his head and the bracelet which was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so also did all the men who were with him. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the people of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, Where are you from? And he answered, I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite. And then David said to him, How is it you were not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the young men and said, Go, cut him down. So he struck him and he died. David said to him, Your blood is on your head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. And so we have this story here. Now, if you remember what we read in 1 Samuel, this doesn't seem to fit with 1 Samuel, because in 1 Samuel, it tells us that the death of Saul happened a little bit differently. Matter of fact, if you remember here in 1 Samuel chapter 31, as they were talking about the battle between Israel and the Philistines, it says the battle in verse 3, the battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the chariots. And then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and pierce me through with it. Otherwise, these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me. But his armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. And thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men on that day. And so it seems like there's this contradiction between what the 1 Samuel wrote and what 2 Samuel wrote. And one of the things that we need to understand about this is that there's really no contradiction. And we'll look at that in just a minute, but I wanted to point out the way that 1 Samuel said that Saul had died and his sons had died. Now, verse 1 of 2 Samuel 1 says, now it came about after the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, that David remained 2 days in Ziklag. Now remember that the Amalekites had taken Ziklag, if you remember, and had burned the city. And so David and his 600 men went after them, and 200 men stayed a little behind because they were too exhausted. And then 400 men went and they destroyed the Amalekites and took all their spoil. And they came back to Ziklag, if you remember. And so they've been in Ziklag for a couple of days because they weren't allowed to go to fight in the battle against Israel by the Philistines, because the Philistines were afraid that David would turn against the Philistines and kill them in order to get in good with the Israelites. And so they didn't allow him to go. And in the meantime, Ziklag had been taken by the Amalekites. And so it says in verse 2, on the 3rd day, in other words, the 3rd day that he'd returned, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes torn and dust on his head. So on the 3rd day, after he came back and after the battle had gone on, this man comes with his clothes torn, and it's the 3rd day, and dust on his head. And usually in that day and time, that was a sign of mourning or great distress when they would throw dust on their heads and rip their clothes. And it says, and it came about when he came to David that he fell to the ground and prostrated himself. So this person comes apparently from the camp of Saul. In other words, from the area of the camp of Saul. It doesn't necessarily mean that he was fighting for Saul or fighting against Saul. It just simply means that he came from that direction. And when he came, he fell down before David when he saw him. So apparently he was coming to David as he was leaving the battlefield, you might say. Verse 3, it says, then David said to him, from where do you come? And he said to him, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. In other words, what he says is that he has managed to flee from Israel. Now, it's interesting that he says, I have escaped from the camp of Israel, which makes it seem that he was a slave of one of the Israelites. And when they fell, when they were defeated, then he was able to escape. So what that does is that sets up this picture of this young man is an enemy of Israel. And the reason that he might say that is because he knows that David is an enemy, or at least that's what he thinks. He thinks David is an enemy of Israel. And so if he can have Israel as his enemy, and then when he talks to David, then David will be more likely to accept his story, because your enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's what he was thinking when he said, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. Now, we don't really know where he came from. We don't really know if that's true. Now, one of the things that this tells us is this. Sometimes people look at this chapter and they go, see, you can't trust the Bible because it contradicts itself. And actually, it does. But what you have to understand is that the contradiction is not in what is written. The contradiction is in what is reported. Here, you're going to have a report about what this young man said. The recording of what he said is true. The writing it down was inspired, like all scripture is inspired, and it is true. Now, what he said was a lie, but God records lies, and God records lies accurately. But just because it's a lie doesn't mean you can't trust the Bible. Matter of fact, it means you can trust the Bible, because the Bible doesn't white coat everything or anything, that the Bible doesn't, put a good spin on everything in order for everything to fit. He's just telling you the story, and it's inspired. And by inspired, I mean the writers inspired as they wrote these things. It's kind of like when the devil told Adam and Eve, the day you eat of the fruit, you won't die. Well, God said they would. Now, either God lied or Satan lied. And I'll pick Satan. Satan was the one who lied. They didn't physically die on that day, but they spiritually died in their relationship with God. And so just because there's this seeming contradiction doesn't mean that you can't trust God's word. You can trust it because it's recording accurately the lie that was told. And therefore, it's helping us understand how it is that David came to learn about Saul and David's attitude towards Saul. And that's what we're going to have in this chapter. In this chapter, we're going to have David's attitude towards Saul after Saul dies. David himself had opportunities to kill Saul a couple of times, and David never did. And so somebody might think, well, now that Saul is dead, David will be happy and he'll rejoice, and he'll, even though he didn't want to kill him himself, he's glad that Saul died. He's glad somebody else had to do it and that he didn't have to do it. Kind of like when Nabal died, and he heard that Nabal died, and David said that God has vindicated me. And so that's what you're going to have in this chapter. You're going to have the attitude that David had towards Saul, and the fact that he wasn't pretending to not be an enemy of Saul. He was an enemy of Saul. And even after Saul's death, he wasn't an enemy of Saul, even though Saul was his enemy. And this is an example of love your enemies. And that example that Jesus used on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 is illustrated for us here in the life of David. This is what it means to love your neighbor, to love your enemy, and to pray for him, and to pray for his good. And that's what we're going to see here in this chapter. So it says, on the third day, behold, this verse 2, on the third day, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes torn and dust in his head. And so he's coming back as if he had been defeated, or in a period of mourning. And it says, and when he came to David, then he fell to the ground and prostrated. And so David said, from where have you come? And he says, I've escaped from the camp of Israel. And David said to him, how did things go? So David wants to know, please tell me. This is the firsthand account that David has of the battle and what happened. And he said, the people have fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead also. And so David finds out finally for the very first time what happened to David and what happened to his men, and especially his sons, because David was concerned about Jonathan, because Jonathan had a covenant with him, and Jonathan was one of his best friends. And even though Jonathan's father, Saul, was the king and out to kill him, Jonathan was not. And so David would be concerned about the welfare of Jonathan, what happened to him. Well, the young man told him that they're all dead. Excuse me, that they're all dead. And so now remember that 1 Samuel, the last chapter of 1 Samuel, chapter 31, told us how they died. Saul had actually committed suicide and fallen on his sword, and his armor bearer didn't even want to kill him. And his armor bearer even committed suicide and fell on his sword when he saw that his master had died. So it says in verse 5, so David said to the young man who told him, how do you know that Saul and his sons and his son Jonathan are dead? And notice that he points out specifically Jonathan, because that's who he had a covenant with. So he was concerned about Jonathan, especially because of that covenant. And so he wanted to know, how did this young man know? Did he hear it, from other people that he happened to pass by, or, did he see the battle? How did he know? Verse 6 says, and the young man who told him said, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen pursued him closely. And so basically what this young man is saying is, I'm sitting there watching, and I'm on Mount Gilboa, which is where Saul died and his sons died. And he's he says he's there on Mount Gilboa, and behold, Saul was leaning on his spear. And so it's interesting that Saul was leaning on his spear, because what that implies is that he was wounded. That's when you lean on your spear. You use it as a crutch if you happen to be wounded. And so he would lean on his spear. And so the implication is that Saul had been wounded. And he says, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen pursued him closely. Now, if you remember that 1 Samuel said in chapter 31 that it wasn't until like a day later that the Philistines happened to come upon the body of Saul and the body of his sons, and that's when they chopped off his head. This young man was saying that they are chasing him and that they're in the middle of catching him. Well, if they caught him, they caught the king, they certainly wouldn't leave him out there in the field just to die without raising him up and showing the victory that they had. So everything this young man is saying is fabricated. And the reason that it's fabricated is because he wants to get in good with David, because like we pointed out at the beginning of this study, that he believes that Saul is David's enemy. And that's true, but David isn't Saul's enemy. And he's trying to get in good with David by pointing out that his enemy has been destroyed and he's the one who killed him. And therefore, he's expecting some kind of reward. But everything he's saying is a lie. And it says in verse 6, and the young man who told him said, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa. And behold, Saul was leaning on his spear. He's wounded. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen pursued him closely. In other words, they were about ready to catch him and to get him. Now, verse 7 says, when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. And I said, here I am. And so, basically, again, he lies and says, Saul was alive. And he turns to me and says, come over here. And he asks me, who are you? In verse 8, he says, and I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And so he, points out that he's an Amalekite. And verse 9 says, then he said to him, please stand beside me and kill me, for agony has seized me, because my life still lingers in me. And so basically what this young man says that Saul said was that Saul said, look, I'm wounded. I haven't died, and the Philistines are going to catch me. And when they catch me, they're going to mistreat me. And so therefore, would you kill me, please? Now, remember, what really happened was Saul wanted his armor bearer to kill him, and his armor bearer refused because he was afraid to kill Saul, because he was the Lord's anointed, of course. And so Saul committed suicide, and his armor bearer did too. And so it says, then he said to me, which is a lie, please stand here beside me and kill me, for agony has seized me, because my life still lingers in me. And it says, verse 10, so I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. In other words, his wound was fatal. He knew he was going to die. And so he was being merciful to him, you might say, by killing him and defeating him. And so it's kind of like he's helping Saul, but he's also helping David, because he's killing David's enemy, he assumes. And it says, and I took the crown which was on his head and the bracelet which was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. So it says he did have the crown and the bracelet. And you might say, well, how did he get it? Well, remember that the Philistines didn't find Saul until at least a day later, because that's what would generally happen. When they're out fighting and they're fighting people, they don't stop as soon as they kill somebody and take their stuff from them, unless maybe they need their sword. They leave in the battlefield. And whoever the victor is, they then return to the battlefield, and they then, spoil the people. They take everything from them, their armor, if they have any money, jewelry, anything of value, they'll take it. But they usually do it after the battle is over, because they don't want to do it in the heat of the battle, unless you happen to be the king that they're fighting against. As soon as they kill the king and they know the king's dead, they'll hold the king up. They'll take him. They don't wait for a day in order to show everybody that they defeated the king. They'll show him immediately, because as soon as the king is defeated, then the army loses confidence and generally loses. And it's the idea of that you have become victorious. And so the reason I'm telling you that is because we're trying to figure out where he got this crown and bracelet. Well, if Saul fell on himself, and remember the reason why Saul was wounded wasn't because people were actually chasing him personally, it's because he got wounded by an arrow that happened to be flying through the air. It seemed to be some random bow and arrow shot that happened to come and pierce him. And so he knew he was going to die. And that's the reason why he ended up killing himself. And so therefore he lay dead. Now, as he's dead, it's probably possible, and I'm sure this is what happened, that this Amalekite young man came upon the body of Saul while he was out in the battlefield, and the Philistines hadn't come to spoil the bodies. And that's this Amalekite finds him, and being an Amalekite, who are very opportunistic, that's their nature. That's the way they're brought up. Remember, these are the individuals that are kind of raid other cities in random raids, and they go through and they take what belongs to everybody else, and they basically like they did with Ziklag, and they found an opportunity where they could take everything and burn the city, and that's what they did. So they were opportunists, and that's what this young man was. He was an opportunist. He was looking for an opportunity, and so that's in him. And so it's important for us to understand that just because we're raised a certain way doesn't mean it's okay for us to act like that. Each of us has the responsibility to act properly, no matter how we're raised. Sometimes some individuals have the idea that, I'm doing what I'm doing because that's the way I was raised. Well, you might have been raised that way, and your parents might have not taught you well, but that doesn't give anybody the right to act contrary to God's will. It doesn't. Just because I was brought up in a house where people lie doesn't mean it's okay for me to lie. And just because I was brought up in a house where people are violent doesn't mean it's okay for me to be violent, or for people to cuss, or for people to use drugs doesn't mean it's okay for me to do it. I have to lead my own life according to what God would want me to do, and that's what I would have to do. And so that's what's under consideration. And as a result of that, this young man went ahead and followed his custom of his country, or the custom that he was brought up. And so he was going to take opportunity when he found opportunity. So that's the reason that he had the bracelet, and that's the reason that he had the crown, because he happened to come upon them. Because 1 Samuel doesn't tell us that when the Philistines found Saul dead later, that they had his crown. If they had his crown, believe me, they would have sent it around the Philistine cities to prove that they had defeated him. But all they had was his head, because this young man had come in the meantime after David had died. After Saul had died, but before the Philistines had come and spoiled the body. And he took the bracelet and the crown. And it says in verse 11, then David took hold of his clothes and tore them. And so also did all the men who were with him. And so notice how David acts. David wasn't happy. David didn't go, yay, my enemy is destroyed. Finally, I get to be king, and he's getting what he deserves. No, David didn't do that. David tore his clothes, which, remember, was a sign of mourning and distress. When you might think that David should be happy and celebrating, he's not. Saul, who considered David his enemy, died, and Saul, who tried to kill David, died. And so you might think, well, Saul is getting his due, and so David should be happy, but he's not, because that's not David's attitude. David's attitude isn't that I want my enemy destroyed. David doesn't want anybody destroyed except for people who don't do God's will. And in that case, it's not that David wants them to be destroyed. It's that David knows that God will destroy them because they're not doing God's will. And so therefore, that's what's under consideration. But again, notice that the purpose for this chapter is to point out David's attitude even after Saul dies. That David's attitude was not, I'm just waiting for him to die. I can't kill Saul, but I'm waiting for him to die, and I can't wait for the day that he dies, and then I'll be so happy. No, he finds out that Saul is dead, and David took hold of his clothes and tore them. And so also did all the men who were with him. And so this was a visible external sign of an inward condition. David was mourning. And not only that, but he had all his men do the same thing. So even the men understood that Saul wasn't David's enemy. Saul might have had David as his enemy, but Saul wasn't David's enemy. And so therefore they all fasted. And remember that these are the same men who before said, look, you have an opportunity to kill Saul. Let's kill him because, God has given him into your hands for you to kill him. But what happened? Well, they learned as they spent time with David, they learned about his proper attitude. And that's what ought to be said about us who are Christians. As people hang around us, they should see the attitude that we have. And they should, if it's a good attitude, want to emulate it because they see how beneficial it is. And so even those men who at one time wanted Saul dead, they mourn too. They tear their clothes as well, those men who are with him. Now, verse 12 says, and they mourned and they wept and they fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan. And so they're mourning and they're weeping for Saul and his son Jonathan, and no doubt his other sons as well, and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel. So David was never at odds with Israel, even though the king of Israel was out trying to kill David. And it says because they had fallen by the sword, in other words, they were killed in battle. And so now, what's David going to do with this young man? Is he going to reward him? Is he going to bless him for his mercy killing? And 1 Samuel 1 and verse 13 says, and David said to the young man who told him, where are you from? And he said, I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite. And remember that it was the Amalekites who David went out and slaughtered because they had killed the people of, they had captured Ziklag, his hometown, and burned it. Remember, while David and his men had gone to present themselves with the Philistines before the battle with Israel started, and while they were gone, the Amalekites came and they destroyed Ziklag and took everybody. And so Saul had to go rescue his people. David had to go rescue his people, if you remember all that. And so now David asks this young man again, who is he? Because David wants to make sure before he gives his verdict. And so it says, David said to the young man, who are you and where are you from? And he answered, I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite. And so he's one of these Amalekites. And remember it said that David destroyed the Amalekites except 400 young men who rode away on camels. Maybe this is one of those young men. We don't know for sure. But anyway, so he was an Amalekite. And verse 14 says, then David said to him, how is it that you were not afraid to stretch out your hand and to destroy the Lord's anointed? So David asked him, why in the world would you think you could kill Saul, the Lord's king, the king of God's people? Now, what this teaches us is a couple of things. If David understood that Saul was wounded and that Saul couldn't live, then you might think that David should thank this young man for doing Saul a service by killing him so that the Philistines wouldn't fall on him and destroy him. But in the Bible, mercy killing is never a good thing. It's still murder. Whether you kill somebody because you're trying to relieve them of their affliction, or whether you kill somebody because it's a murder. It's actually the same attitude. Most people that kill somebody because of a mercy killing do it because they hate that person. You might say, well, what do you mean they hate that person? Well, for example, they might hate the fact that that person is suffering. And so what we're going to do is we're going to put them out of their misery and we're going to kill them. Well, it's still done out of hate. You don't love them. If you love somebody, you want them to get better. If you love somebody, you bear with them in their pain. You don't kill them in their pain and act like you did a service. The fact is that if you kill them, it's because you hate the way the condition is. For example, if somebody has an old, grandma or grandpa or somebody that's riddled with cancer, and they say, well, I'm going to kill them because it's going to relieve them of their pain. It's not their pain they're trying to relieve. It's their personal pain they're trying to relieve. That they're pained about the fact that this person is suffering. But the one who puts us through suffering is God. God's the one who allows us to suffer. And God knows what we can handle and what we can't handle. And that's why Job, if you read the story of Job, Job wanted to die. Job asked God to remove his hand from him. In other words, take his life away so that he could die. But you never see Job picking up a sword or Job picking up a knife in order to kill himself or asking his friends to kill him, because he understood that would be wrong. And therefore, being wrong, he wanted to make sure that he was right with God, even in his death. And so that's one of the things that this shows you about King David. David did not hold mercy killing as an alternative and as a good thing and as a loving thing to do to somebody, or else he wouldn't have given the verdict that he did for this individual. Instead of punishing him, he would have blessed him. He would have given him a reward for doing that. But he says, how is it that you were not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? That's what's under consideration. You weren't afraid to do that. Now, what's also interesting, of course, is that this is a little parallel with Jesus when he dies. Jesus had an inscription over his head which said King of the Jews. And the high priest and those people, they're the ones who put him to death. And they weren't afraid of putting to death God's anointed. They killed God's anointed, the one who was supposed to be king. They killed him. Just like Saul was trying to kill David, and now this Amalekite says that he killed Saul, and Saul was the Lord's anointed. And so God is not pleased when we take matters into our own hands and kill the people that God has appointed as the ruler over his people, which in our case today is Jesus. And there are people today who are still killing Jesus, not necessarily physically, but they're killing him with their words, or they're killing him with their ideas, that he's not the Son of God, that he's, a lie, and that, he's just a prophet, and he's not who he says he is. And so they basically kill him. Well, let's see what David does. Verse 15 says, and David called one of the young men and said to him, go, cut him down. So he struck him and he died. Now you might say, well, what gives David the right to do this? Well, number one, David is now the next king. He is the anointed king. So one of his roles is to execute justice. And so even though his enemy died, rather than him looking at the man who killed him and reward him, David is giving him justice because he killed the Lord's anointed. And so David never looked at Saul as if Saul was his enemy. And so he struck him and he died. And so David was executing judgment on a criminal who killed the Lord's anointed. Now, verse 16 says, David said to him, your blood is on your head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. Now, the other thing I want you to notice is I don't know whether David knew this man was lying or not. I don't believe David did. And so therefore, David was killing him, whether what he said was true or not. David was putting him to death because of his own testimony. His own testimony would convict him of this crime. And so because he said that I have killed the Lord's anointed, therefore he deserves to die. And so one of the things that this teaches us is that what we claim, what we're willing to profess, whether true or untrue, is going to bear consequences on us. And so we need to remember that. Just because you tell a lie because you think it's going to benefit somebody, we have to bear the consequence of that lie. And David was being just here. So whether this young man actually killed Saul or not is not the point. The point was that he said he did, and therefore he was guilty. And therefore, David put him to death because of his own testimony. Now, verse 17. In verse 17, we're going to see the fact that David laments over Saul and Jonathan. And David writes this lamentation about the death of his friend, Jonathan, and Saul. And remember that David was a musician. Remember that when Saul would be irritated, that he would call in David, and David would play until the irritation would leave him. Now, let's see the song that David writes over his friend Jonathan and Saul. for 2 Samuel 1:17 says, then David chanted with this lament over Saul and Jonathan, his son. And he told them to teach the sons of Judah the song of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jashar. Now, I'm just going to read this once and go through it just to save some time. But Jashar is a book that apparently they had that had various writings in it. And it's just like today, some people have books, and sometimes governments write books, and sometimes the books stay around, and sometimes they don't. And so here's a book, Jashar. Now, there is a book today that you can find in Bible stores and those kind of places that says it's the book of Jashar, but it's not. It's just a fake, and anybody can just say it's the book of Jashar in order for them to sell books, and that's exactly what they've done. But anyway, it was written down, and here's the song. Your beauty, O Israel, is slain on your high place. How have the mighty fallen? So the beauty would be Saul and his men, the rulers, those people who were supposed to represent them. He says, your beauty, O Israel, is slain on the high places. How have the mighty men fallen? Tell it not in Gath, and proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will exalt. And so basically, David says, I'm going to sing this lament, but it's not for the Philistines. It's not so the Philistines can rejoice and be happy. It's a lament. It's to make whoever sings it feel bad, not feel happy. And so he points that out in the beginning of his song. Now, verse 21 says, O mountain of Gilboa, let not dew or rain be on you, nor fields of offerings, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled, and the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. And so in verse 21, he points out that it was on the mountain of Gilboa where Saul was found dead, and where the young man said that he was, he found Saul and killed him. And it's also what 1 Samuel, the last chapter, told us, where he died. And so he writes about Gilboa, and he basically says, let it be cursed, because it was the place where Saul died and his men died. And it says, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled. In other words, the idea of defiling the shield is that they took his shield and he died. They killed him. And the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. And this idea of not anointed with oil, some people have say that, they had these shields, and these shields required them to oil the shield because they had leather on them. And certainly that's possible. And that might be what's under consideration. Or it might be under consideration that when he says not anointed with oil, was the fact that he didn't have God's approval in this fight, in this war. And that's one of the reasons that he fell. And so he's just pointing out that he fell because, he wasn't necessarily right with the Lord. Now, verse 22 says, from the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. In other words, what he's saying is that Jonathan would go and he'd fight against those mighty men of war, his enemies. He would fight against the mighty ones. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't a coward. That's the idea when it says from the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty. The idea of the fat of the mighty is not that they're fat. The idea of the fat of the mighty is fat represents the best. And that's one of the reasons why in the sacrifices, God always got the fat, because the fat represented the best of the animal. Sometimes people who are Sabbatarians, they'll point out that God eats the fat because it's not good for people to eat the fat, but that's really not why. He eats the fat because it represents the good. Try eating meat that doesn't have very much fat in it, and it doesn't taste very good. It's rather tasteless. And what makes our food tasty is the fat. And so the fat represents the best. And so Jonathan would go and fight against the best of the mighty. He wasn't a coward. He wouldn't turn away from them. And it says, and the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. In other words, he wasn't a coward. He was willing to fight wherever the fight took him and wherever God wanted him to fight. And it says, and the sword of Saul did not return empty. In other words, Saul had also gone out and won quite a few victories. Saul generally, won his battles when he was right with God, but because he wasn't right with God in this battle, remember, because he went and talked to the witch at Endor, and that's one of the reasons why God rejected him finally, to the point where he was put to death, was because he went and talked to the medium at Endor. And so, but before then, Saul had many victories, and that's what he's singing about. Now, verse 23, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and pleasant in their life, and in their death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. And so he points out that Saul and Jonathan were beloved and were pleasant in their life. In other words, they had a good life, but they were faithful to each other and they were loyal with each other. And that's one thing that you saw about Jonathan. Jonathan knew that Saul, his father, wasn't doing what was right, but Jonathan was still loyal to him because he was his father and he was the Lord's anointed. And even though he was doing wrong, Jonathan was still faithful to him. And it says, and in their death, they were not parted. So they weren't separated. And what that means is that they fought the same battle and they died in the same way, or maybe not the same way, but they died together at the same time. And it says they were swifter than eagles and they were stronger than lions. In other words, David is praising their ability to wage war and their ability to fight. And he was pointing out just exactly how courageous they were. Now, verse 24, O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. And so one of the reasons that Israel should mourn for Saul was because Saul helped them a lot. Saul clothed them with luxury and scarlet, and he put ornaments of gold. You remember when the Philistines first came and the Amalekites first came, that Saul was the one who went out and fought against them. And what that does is, had Saul not fought against them, then those Amalekites and Philistines and those individuals would have come in and they would have taken all the good things from Israel. The foreign armies would have devastated the people and taken all their goods and their produce, and they wouldn't have anything. And the reason they could have what they have was because of Saul and his ability to fight and lead them. And that's what a good government's supposed to do. A good government's supposed to make it possible for the people that it's governing to be blessed, to pursue happiness, you might say, and to level the playing fields. It's not the government's job to pick and choose who gets to be blessed. It's the government's job to make a level playing field for everyone to be blessed who wishes to be blessed. Not the government's going to bless you and make you blessed, but the government's going to give you opportunity to be blessed, an opportunity to, as he says here, to be dressed luxuriously and to have ornaments of gold. And that's the work of a government. They're supposed to make sure that it's people have an environment in which they can work and make a living, and a government that allows freedom is the government that does that the most. And those governments that hinder freedom keep people from having luxuries and wearing gold apparel. In other words, being rich. Matter of fact, many of them condemn the rich people who have taken opportunities of those opportunities and have tried to somehow mitigate what they've done and take it from them in order to give to other people who maybe don't work as hard. And that doesn't mean that there's not greedy rich people. There are greedy poor people as well. Just because somebody's rich doesn't mean they're greedy. And just because somebody's poor doesn't mean that they're not. And so that's what a government's supposed to do. And that's what Saul did. And that's why David sang about him, because he helped Israel. Even though he himself wasn't necessarily the best ruler personally or morally, he still helped the people in what he was supposed to do. Now it says, verse 25, how have the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? Jonathan is slain on the high place. And so he points out that Jonathan, his brother, had died as well. And verse 26 says, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. You have been very pleasant to me. Your love to me was more wonderful than the love of women. And because of our day and our culture, this needs to be explained. And that's pretty sad. In our day and our culture, people take the word love and they change it for the word sex, and they make love mean sex. And so therefore, Jonathan and David had sex together like he does with women. That's not what love means. Love isn't talking about sex. Love is talking about an appreciation and a respect for one another. That's why Jesus says we're supposed to love our enemies. Doesn't mean we're supposed to have sex with them. It means that we're supposed to love them. We're supposed to care about them. We're supposed to want the best for their welfare. And so when David speaks about his love for Jonathan was more wonderful than the love of women, he's talking about his love for another man as men. And there's a pleasant relationship that exists between men who are best friends, and there's a special relationship that exists between a man and his wife. And they're different. And one can certainly be more wonderful than the other if one's more pleasant than the other. And that's what he's talking about here. And it's just an expression that indicates that David is going to miss, his brother, his friend Jonathan, and that's why he calls him my brother Jonathan. They were like brothers, and so he says your love to me was more wonderful than the love of women. And the reason I have to explain this to us today is because of our culture, and that's what happens when you mess around with the principles that are found in the Word of God. It's kind of like today in our culture, this idea of gender orientation and somebody choosing what gender they are is awful. It's terrible. People don't know how to speak to each other. It's confusing. Medical forms have become huge because of those silly ideas and those things. And so that's what happens when you leave God's word and you start doing your own thing. It causes confusion and difficulty, and it creates all kinds of problems. And those are some of the problems that we're having in our society today with how people are supposed to treat one another, because they're treating it, they're claiming that they're not who God made them, and other people who see them are supposed to know that by looking at them. And if you don't, refer to them the way they want to be referred to, even though you might have just met them, then they get upset. And so it's all confusing. And that's what happens when you leave God. And that's why I had to explain this, because in our culture in the United States, it's going that way. One of the interesting things about human history is that when men and women became more homosexual in their positions, the countries began to fall. And so that's what we're seeing in our country. And that's why we have so much division. And that's just a symptom of it that you see going on in our culture. But I had to explain that to us because this word love and the way people look at it today, love here is not talking about sex. It's talking about doing what's best for somebody and caring about them and respecting them. And so in verse 27, it says, how have the mighty fallen and the weapons of war perished? Notice what he says. He says that the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war have perished. Now, what does this show us? Well, this shows us David's attitude toward his enemy. And that's what Jesus meant, as I mentioned, in the Sermon on the Mount, when he said, love your enemies. David loved his enemy. Now, that enemy wasn't David's, and David didn't look at him as his enemy. And that's the way we're supposed to look at people who claim to be our enemies. We don't look at them as if they're our enemies. We look at them as if they're individuals who maybe just are confused or who don't understand or who were taught wrong. They're not really our enemies. And that's why the scriptures teach us in Ephesians that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, it's against principalities and powers and rulers in high places. In other words, it's the influences and the teaching that's done that people start to follow. And so our enemies are not people. We don't have people as our enemies. We have the attitudes that they bear are our enemies. But what this shows you is that David loved his enemy. And David, even after Saul died, did not rejoice over him and did not exalt over the fact that his enemy died. Now, one of the other things that I want you to understand is this happens privately. And what do I mean by privately? Well, by privately, I mean this happens without Israel knowing about it. This doesn't happen, when David goes back to Israel and David is putting on a show. It's not like David goes over there to Israel and puts on this show and people go, oh, look at David. This is happening in Ziklag. This is his own private home. This is his own private place. Israel isn't there. This is in the land of the Philistines that he's doing this and that he wrote this song. So that's not what's under consideration here. David isn't doing this for the purpose of proving to other people that, he really liked Saul, when in reality he didn't, and he's just putting on a show. And that's what some people do. Some people put on a show when somebody dies because they really hated them, they didn't like them, but now they're dead, they're going to put on a show as if they liked them and as if they were like the best of friends. And that's not what's happening here. This is done with David and his own men in his own town by himself without Israel even knowing about it. Israel knew about it later, but while it was happening, David wasn't doing it to impress anybody. He was doing it because this was his own personal attitude. And so it shows you the difference between somebody who loves their enemy and somebody who hates their enemy. And so I pray that God has blessed you for being here. Pray that God continues to bless you as you study and search the Word of God, and pray that He helps us always to do His will. Pray God blesses you in all things.